Alien is a masterpiece of sci-fi horror films that has forever changed not only the genre itself but cinema as a whole. You've all seen it, probably more than once, but have you ever truly thought about what this film is actually about? Of course, it's about a terrifying monster and the survival of a spaceship crew trapped in an enclosed space with it. But there are reasons why, even more than 40 years after its release, film scholars are still obsessed with it, constantly analyzing and discussing it. The reason for this is not only the ambiguity and incompleteness of the story, but also the troubled production, underfunding, deleted scenes during editing, rushed deadlines, studio interference and other factors. But that only makes it more interesting to try and reconstruct what was lost, and at the same time reveal a side of Alien that even its most devoted fans may not know. Enjoy the viewing. The events of Alien take place almost entirely aboard the space tug Nostromo, which at the start of the film is transporting a massive cargo platform carrying millions of tons of ore to Earth. This structure resembles a gigantic megatanker, composed of countless dark industrial corridors with only a few small, cozy sections that bear the subtle touch of human presence. When the onboard computer activates, we see a 9-digit registration number, implying that ships like this exist in vast numbers, making Nostromo just one unit in a massive fleet. In this world, resources have long been mined beyond our home planet and transported to Earth over the course of months or even years. The company behind this business is the mega corporation Weyland-Yutani. According to Ridley Scott, it was one of several corporations in the future, headquartered in Honolulu with Japanese co-owners, something subtly reflected in the samurai-inspired elements of the crew's attire. The world of Alien shares many similarities with the world of Blade Runner, though these connections mostly appear in small details and background elements. By the year 2122, near-Earth space has already been fully explored and colonized by humans. However, people spend most of their times in cryosleep, only waking occasionally when an emergency arises. As long as everything runs smoothly, it is the machines that rule this domain. The Nostromo is driven by Mother, a computer, and as far as running the ships goes, the crew is secondary. Once on the ship, their function is minimal. Next, we find ourselves inside the hull of the Nostromo. The first movement in the frame is subtle, and the music shifts to something mysterious. A barely noticeable sway of loose straps, the creak of a chair, the rustling of paper, and a small toy gently rocking in the background. It feels as if we've been watching a ghost all along, and Death has stepped onto the bridge, activated the computer, put on the pilot's helmet, and begun reading an incoming transmission. Even before we meet the main characters, we can already sense the presence of an unseen entity aboard the Nostromo. Everyone here calls it Mother, always speaking of it with the utmost respect. The unusual introduction to the ship's artificial intelligence hints that Mother is more than just a system. She is a full-fledged character in this story. At this moment, she's in control, and it is she who has made the decision to alter the ship's course and wake up her children. After processing the received data, we are metaphorically grabbed by the hand and led to wake up the rest of the crew. The depressurization of the cryochamber is accompanied by a rush of air. A bright, cozy room seems to come to life. To the sound of majestic music, the astronauts awaken. A solemn moment of life emerging in the cold corridors of the Nostromo. At first glance, Mother may seem like nothing more than a software shell, but as the story unfolds, we increasingly begin to suspect that she also has something resembling a body whose very structure we now find ourselves inside. And if you listen closely to the surroundings, you might even hear her breathing. Here, far from Earth, the crew is entirely under Mother's care. She is their ears, their eyes, and their singular decision-making center. Mother possesses power, authority, and a degree of free will far beyond that of any living being aboard. In this sense, she's arguably more alive than the people under her watch. You might argue that she's merely a blind executor of Weyland-Yutani's orders, or rather of the pre-programmed directives within her system.
Mother's interrupted the course of our journey. Programmed to do that should certain conditions arise. They have.
But I propose a different perspective, one where for a moment we set aside the company's influence and instead focus on the way Mother communicates with the crew. This interaction takes place in an isolated room, accessibly only to a single person, the Captain Dallas, using a special key. Visually, this is perhaps the warmest and most inviting space aboard the ship. Concept designer Ron Cobb, responsible for the Nostromo's interiors, explained in an interview that this room was meant to resemble a small temple filled with the soft glow of burning candles.
Really wanted us to explore the sense that aspects of the Nostromo might look like a cathedral with votive candles, which of course is what turns out to be the computer, the master computer.
Ridley Scott, in turn, referred to this room as the womb, a temple, a womb. Both are strange and unusual creative choices, but what do they mean? Let's break it down. This space indeed resembles a womb, both in shape and function. A rounded chamber designed for a single occupant, where Mother treats them with the warmth and care. The communication between them is sacred, deeply intimate, and almost entirely one-sided. Here Mother speaks, Captain Dallas listens, and that's the only way it works. Then, assuming the role of a prophet, he carries the word of God to the rest of the crew. What's the story, Mother? The question sounds as if this man is speaking not to a computer, but to an oracle in the ancient temple, seeking to learn his fate. Just like in ancient myths, it is not the human who chart the course of their journey, but higher powers that guide them. No matter which metaphor you choose, its core message quickly becomes clear. Within this hierarchical structure aboard the ship, Mother is number one. She is the mature parent, the oracle in the temple, while the crew members are dependent children. Only Mother has true autonomy and is alive, whereas the humans are stripped of it, reduced to mere instruments in the hands of the machine. It was Mother who made the fateful turn. It was she who woke the crew and provided them with instructions. She controls the situation, exploiting the crew's total dependence on her, and of course their personal fears.
On penalty of total forfeiture of shares.
You got that?
None of them understand the full picture, except for Ash, whom we later discover is a company spy with special clearance, and Dallas, who shares a unique relationship with Mother by virtue of possessing the only key to her womb. Dallas didn't know everything, but he always had the ability to pressure Mother and uncover the details of her decisions, details that revealed the alien specimen was far more important to her than the crew's survival. Ripley managed to do this, but Dallas unfortunately was too accustomed to following orders and never saw the need to question them. For him, obedience was paramount.
Standard procedure is to do what the hell they tell you to do.
Such blind obedience blurs the lines between the living and the inanimate. Just compare Dallas to Ash, portrayed brilliantly by Ian Holm. Throughout the film, the android behaves like a human, even when he's alone, when there's no practical reason to maintain the act. Ash is capable of displaying a wide range of emotions, implying some form of cognitive activity similar to human thought. On first viewing, nothing betrays face his true nature, until the moment his insights are revealed. Today, this plot twist might not seem shocking, but in 1979 it was a jaw-dropping as the famous chestbuster scene. Ash's behavior is almost entirely human. He is, for all intents and purposes, a person. You might argue that he's just a machine following Weyland-Yutani's programming. But isn't Dallas behaving in exactly the same way? Didn't he follow orders without questions, without even considering disobedience? So does that make him a machine too? In Alien, Ridley Scott touched on a thought-provoking idea, one that he would further explore in Blade Runner. Who's more alive? The cold and unconsciously driven Deckard, mechanically carrying out orders from his superiors, or the artificially created replicant who, in his short existence, managed to break free from his predetermined role and choose redemption over murder? It's difficult to call a being a truly human if their psyche has regressed to the point of mindlessly executing instructions, having lost all ability for self-reflection. Kubrick played with this idea as well, showing how in space humans become passive observers, mere servants to artificial intelligence, while machines flourish, gaining freedom, communicating and dancing with one another to the waltz. All the while humans remain unconscious, prisoners of their own technology. Dallas has been completely absorbed by the mechanized mother. Visually, he blends into her internal structures, becoming just another component of Nostromo. He mirrors that enigmatic alien on LV-426, fused with his chair, indistinguishable from his profession and function within the ship. And by the end of the film, something eerily similar happens to Dallas. He begins to dissolve into the structure of the Nostromo itself, quite literally. I compared Alien to a Kubrick film for a reason. The very structure of this horror film was heavily inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey. Ridley Scott has repeatedly stated that he considers it the pinnacle of science fiction, one that simply cannot be surpassed. Perhaps the strongest evidence of 2001's influence on Alien's world comes from Prometheus screenwriter Damon Lindelof. When he was first hired and met with Ridley, they spent an entire day discussing the philosophy of A Space Odyssey. At the center of the story is the mysterious black monolith, whose encounter alters the course of human evolution. This object, which appeared out of nowhere, was so foreign to the group of Australopithecines that the very contact with it triggered profound religious experiences. These experiences set the course for the development of our species and made humanity's eventual arrival on the moon inevitable. The monolith called us to the moon, and now it calls us back to Earth, making us reflect on ourselves and realize something crucial about our own nature. However, the mysterious signal forces us to discard the path of self-reflection and instead propel ourselves further into the depth of space, driven by technological advancement. As a result, humanity will eventually return to Earth, but this time we must fight against our own technologies. The film Alien follows a similar structure. The ship's road leads deep into space and then back towards Earth, but on the return journey it encounters a mysterious signal, which shifts the course away from the home planet. As a result of this maneuver, the configuration of the crew aboard the spaceship is irreversibly changed. The artificial intelligence, represented by Ash, gains special privileges, while the humans completely lose their autonomy, becoming expendable resources for the successful completion of the mission. The mission's conclusion involves the destruction and repurposing of the humans into upgraded components of the mechanized mother. When creating this video, I had no intention of repeating what you've already seen in other YouTube channels. However, at the same time, I simply can't ignore the personality of H.R. Giger and his immense contribution to the design of Alien and the creation of the entire film. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with this person. The Swiss artist spent too much of his childhood plagued by frequent nightmares. He was tortured by visions where he was either trapped in narrow passages or pursued by biomechanical monsters who intended to castrate him. Giger explained that his relentless desire to create stemmed from these recurrent nightmares. His art served as a form of exorcism. This way, he could extract the monsters from his mind and destroy them, decorating the walls around them. Afterward, his soul would feel relieved. Although the image of person sitting in the center of a gallery surrounded by episodes of their own nightmares looks equally disturbing. The themes of this work are self-explanatory. Many of Giger's paintings are filled with sexual imagery, various depictions of genitalia and their mutual penetration. Often these were accompanied by mechanized elements like tubes and chains. Women also appear in his art, typically in scenes of violence, painful childbirth, or orgies involving half humans, half machines, and half lizards. This is another striking feature of Giger's work, the absence of a boundary between human and machine. Indeed, it was this very person, H.R. Giger, who was recommended by Dan O'Bannon and hired by Ridley Scott to work on Alien. It's naive to think that Ridley asked Giger to forget anything he had done before and start creating in a completely different style. Giger was responsible for incorporating many sexual motives into the design of the alien creature and the film's sets. It's important to note that he also worked on the exterior design of the ship on the planetoid LV-426, its pilot, the landscape, and so on. His style in Alien fits perfectly because reproduction in a broad sense is a key theme of the film. In the original script by Dan O'Bannon and Ron Shusett, the alien traveler lands on the planetoid and discovers a pyramid, which he begins to explore. Inside, he finds the eggs of a mysterious race that had been lying there for millions of years. One of the eggs opens, releasing a creature that impregnates the traveler through his mouth and forces him to give birth. This planet was once home to a race with an incredibly complex and bloody reproductive ritual. They had two sexes, but to reproduce they needed a third being, which was forcibly impregnated and sacrificed in the process. Reproduction was an incredibly complex process for this race and entailed an excessive exploitation of the biosphere, which led to their eventual extinction. The pyramid was the center of their culture and religion, their reproduction temple. With this knowledge, it becomes clear why Ridley Scott chose Giger. He needed his touch to design the planetoid, from the landscape and pyramid to the monster itself. LV-426 was inspired by the landscapes of Cappadocia in Turkey, with its unique volcanic formation and phallic growths. Giger mixed in his biomechanical elements, making it difficult for the audience to even understand what the ground beneath the explorer's feet was made of. These were early sketches by Giger, but according to him, most of it was ultimately cut out by Ridley Scott. In the original plans of the director, there was a pyramid. The Nostromo crew was supposed to visit it right after finding the dead pilot. The entrance inside would be blocked, but they would have to climb to the top. It was here that Kane was supposed to set up his tripod and descend much deeper into the earth. Over the years, the pyramid had been swallowed by the ground, and its real size would be even more immense. The act of entering the pyramid was planned to be presented to the viewer as the process of fertilization. Ridley Scott described his idea in an interview with Fantastic Films as follows: Kane goes inside and finds a small housing and then goes through a hole in the floor. I was doing this whole bloody thing as vagina, going right through. It's like the pyramid is a virgin. I was going to have him slit the membrane and then gas or air or whatever would come wafting out, and he's got to go through the spooky thing of going through this slit. But later, due to budget problems, the idea of pyramid had to be completely abandoned. However, decades later, we still managed to see it on the big screen in Prometheus. This pyramid on the LV-223 planet are almost identical to the one I just described, with the only difference being that by the time of the Prometheus expedition, the engineers had already taken over. If you look closely, you can even see one of the murals depicting the ancient ancestors of the Xenomorphs. The solution to this situation was found by Giger, and some of his sketches show how it was done. The pyramid and the ship were merged into one. The X-Silo and the spacecraft are now joined together. The astronauts enter through one of the three sewers, wind their way through the snail corridor, and find the corpse of the pilot, which is twice as big as a human. Next to the seat of the pilot, there's a hole that leads into the depths of the silo. So the silo was placed under the spacecraft, as if a mini UFO had landed on an anthill, and the ants had eaten their way through the spacecraft, like parasites, in order to use the pilot as a host. You heard correctly. No one during the film's creation even thought that the ship was transporting the X. These were always two separate structures. It was only later that Ridley Scott stated that the X had always been in the hold of the space jockey's ship, which genuinely surprised everyone involved in the production. The idea of entering the pyramid with the rupture of the hymen didn't disappear without a trace either. In the final version of Alien, the entire process of visiting the planetoid is presented to us as an act of fertilization, which may sound insane, but it was also borrowed from A Space Odyssey. There, the journey of the Discovery towards Jupiter resembled the movement of a phallic object towards an egg. Entering the portal was framed as an orgasm, followed by conception and the development of a child in the womb. So why all these in Alien, you might ask? The thing is, the Discovery ship controlled by Hal and the Nostromo controlled by the Mother are driven by identical forces. These forces, I'll jump ahead and say, are behind the motivation of Ash, the Nostromo crew, and even the alien, though in its case in a hyperbolized form. Perhaps the most accurate word to describe these forces would be libido, in the interpretation of Sigmund Freud. Libido is the collective of unconscious human instincts, especially those related to pleasure, survival, and sexual desires. In 2001: A Space Odyssey, through the metaphor of a sexual act, Kubrick tells us what is driving humanity at that specific moment: the body, or unconscious bodily desires. In Alien, Mother embodies all the same forces, from corporate greed to the instinct of survival. The ship hovers over the target, and the part where the pilots are begin to slowly elongate. This personally evokes parallels with the scene at the end, where the alien's jaw elongates upon seeing Ripley's half-naked, thus mimicking the sexual interest of the audience in the theater. Again, the sexual connotation of this scene is confirmed both by the actress and the director. After detaching, the Nostromo enters the atmosphere of the celestial body. On the captain's bridge radar, the phrase orbit insertion appears. Three people emerge from the object, wearing large spherical helmets, which further visually equates them to sperm. Then, fighting the harsh environment, they move toward the mysterious ship, which has spread its legs nearby. I understand this all sounds absurd and crass, but it cannot be described otherwise, as the entrance hall are precisely at the center of two bands, resembling female genitalia. There is no ambiguity here either. Few of those involved had other association with the appearance of those holes. In Prometheus, by the way, these holes are used as part of the allegory of David's rebirth and his transformation into a fully realized human after they experience female care for the first time. In Covenant, this concept is repeated. The crew is simply the seed in the body of Mother who fertilizes planets. Colonization here is effectively equates with ejaculation, and the characters make decisions largely unconsciously, relying on their fears and phobias.
I think it's safe to say that none of us are too keen on getting back into one of those pods.
Moving on, once inside the alien body, our sperm-like beings first navigate through winding passages of either organic or technological origin, then end up in a womb where they see the remnants of previous fertilization. Then, as is often the case, the most curious and agile one squeezes through another opening, reaching its main goal, the egg, while also breaking the integrity of the technological placenta. This is how Ridley Scott referred to those blue beams. Lucky Kane becomes the first member of the Nostromo crew to wake up and the only one who volunteered for the expedition.
I'll volunteer to be in the first group to go out.
One energetic spermatozoon is more than enough for the miracle of conception to occur. From the crew members' perspective, it's all automatic. The people in this scheme are just the seed in the Nostromo ship, which they awakened, delivered, directed in the right direction and fired. LV-426 is a planetary mystery. We know absolutely nothing about this place and what happened here, or the monster that lives here, its motives and goals. Immediately after the 1969 release, only a few knew that the Xenomorph was actually driven by its hypertrophied libido, or about its full reproductive cycle, which was partly cut from the theatrical version. I'm talking about the scene with the Xenomorph's nest. Ridley Scott often said that he removed it to keep the pacing intact. This is an excuse, as Giger himself confirmed that neither he nor the director were satisfied with the quality of the created nest, so they decided to remove it. While we explore these mysterious places with the astronauts, questions keep popping up in our heads. Some of the answers we've gotten, but the several decades, all of this was shrouded in mystery. Is this a biomechanical ship, or did the Xenomorphs turn it into one after breaking out of their den? How can this alien be one with the mechanical part of the ship? Did this guy merge with it, or did he grow out of it? Is it a natural symbiosis, or was the pilot forcibly integrated into the ship? All of these seemed beyond our understanding of how the world around us works, which is why the object has such an overwhelming effect. But this is a Giger's work, the surrealist artist. He doesn't make his biomechanoids functional. All of that doesn't matter, but the idea does. Before analyzing all these, we must once again give credit to the artist. The Space Jockey is a masterpiece of props, on the same level as Kubrick's Black Monolith, which by the way Giger was inspired by when designing it, but we'll talk more about that a little later. The similarities between the pilots of two ships are most clearly seen. I've mentioned them already. Dallas, the captain of the Nostromo, sits in a similar dome-shaped compartment, on a rotating chair staring at a monitor. The Space Jockey is also located in a giant dome, although in the film this is less obvious because the prop wasn't fully built due to budget issues. Of course, Dallas isn't physically merged with the ship, but his dependence on it is constantly emphasized on screen. He runs to Mother at her first call and dares to defy her. The alien ship had been on the planetoid in isolation for a long time. During all this time, its crew remained in the form of eggs. As we learn towards the end of the film, The Xenomorph transforms its victims into cocoons, using their bodies as food for its spores. In such a state, the crew can exist for centuries, waiting for their next victim. Something similar happens aboard the Nostromo. Here, people can remain in cryosleep capsules for long periods under the care of Mother. Their metabolism is slowed to a minimum, and their lifespan is expanded exponentially. In terms of function, they are no different from spores. Visually, the cryocapsules even resemble the design of an egg. This leads to the idea that Xenomorph contain, if not the key to absolute immortality, then at least a significant increase in their human lifespan. These creatures have the ability to manipulate their metabolism in extraordinary ways, which is something desperately sought after by people like Peter Weyland, who are willing to do anything for a few more years of life. The alien is a unique creature in the horror genre and definitely my favorite monster. Beyond its stunning design, it's endowed with an incredibly simple yet brilliant idea. The weapon of the alien is its libido. The Xenomorph kills not because it wants to eat you, but because that is how it reproduces. Its reproductive success depends on the number of living beings that die around it. Death and the creation of new life, violence and sexuality in Alien are simply inseparable. The creature lies its spores in other living organisms, and once those grow strong, they break through the chest to grow within hours and begin turning every available body into cocoons. The Xenomorph will continue doing this until there is no more flesh around, and once it has no more targets to impregnate, it curls up in a quiet spot, away from light and noise, and peacefully completes its reproductive cycle. This, in fact, is what happened at the end of the film in front of Ripley. Director Ridley Scott repeatedly compared it to insects with their short life cycle. Like a butterfly or an insect, it has a limited lifespan in which to reproduce itself. It also helped explain why it didn't attack Ripley in the Narcissus. Its days were over. Like a chameleon, it had found a protective corner in that ship and was working itself in there to die. Yes, in other interviews, it has been clarified that the Xenomorph doesn't actually die at the end of its cycle, but rather transforms into a cocoon, reducing its metabolism to a minimum while waiting for the right opportunity to be reborn. This confusion and ambiguity stem from the various versions of the ending and the studio's refusal to film the one Ridley Scott proposed, where Ripley dies and the Xenomorph gains intelligence and the ability to speak. It might sound like madness, but it made sense in the mind of Dan O'Bannon. He envisioned that the Xenomorph's urge to reproduce is temporary, and after that it becomes a more peaceful and intelligent creature. In the recent Alien Romulus, as you can imagine, they used the version where the Xenomorph falls into a sleep-like state and creates a protective cocoon around itself. The Xenomorph's life cycle doesn't so much revolve around death-rebirth cycles, but rather the fluctuation at its metabolic level, depending on the available biomass around it. I wanted the alien possessed the highest point of this sexual force. The Xenomorph's extreme libido is emphasized throughout its life cycle design. Its egg represents the female womb, and its exit is designed accordingly. The controversy surrounding the egg design, which led H.R. Giger to make revisions, is well known and doesn't need further elaboration here. The facehugger is literally a penis on legs, which is how it was referred to on set. It pursues its victims and leaps into them, fertilizing through the mouth. The moment of attack mirrors oral sex involving both male and female genital organs simultaneously. The xenomorph blends both sexual characteristics as a hermaphrodite, and during the attack it disregards the gender of its victim. Whether the victim is male or female, it doesn't matter. The attacked male loses his masculinity, as seen with Kane. The director was deliberate in dressing him in such clothing to emphasize this. The adult form is an elegant 2-meter body with tenders seemingly assembled from pieces of torn condoms, and the penetrating attacks come from an extendable jaw, heavily lubricated. The shape of the sexual organ is evident in both the extended back of the xenomorph's head and the chest buster. These 4 stages represent the entire reproductive cycle of the xenomorph. Giger depicted this in a famous illustration, which was initially intended to be a mural on the wall of the pyramid room containing the spores. Originally, there was no queen. The adult xenomorph was supposed to create the egg, and it was depicted at the top of the mural, framing the rest of the development stages with its body. The inclusion of the queen, in my view, goes against the fundamental idea of the xenomorphs, significantly simplifying it, if not completely diminishing it. The xenomorph is not a unit in a colony, but an external parasite that fertilizes and destroys everything around it and won't stop until absolute silence reigns. Though there was still a comparison with ants. I think ants have no sense of beginning or end. They just are born, run around doing this thing like everybody else in the community and die. And I think that might have been the alien. So maybe the alien had no intelligence except pure intuition about survival, right? The xenomorph represents pure egotistical survival and reproduction, existing outside of morality, self-reflection and time. Every time it appears, it is different because it builds its body based on circumstances, using various building materials, different DNA chains and structures. This very concept will later be at the core of the black goo in future Ridley Scott films. The black goo is nothing more than a tiny, irreducible microorganism with properties similar to those of xenomorphs. Future details will also suggest that not only meat, but sometimes even plants or, for instance, mechanical parts of the ship's hull could be used in the process. This explains the rapid growth of the xenomorph into an adult form and its transformation into a biomechanical creature. Fans have spent years theorizing about how exactly the xenomorph could grow from a chestbuster to a 2-meter monster in a matter of hours. Ridley Scott mentioned in an interview that he wanted to film a short scene that would explain this gap. In it, the crew would observe the process of an adult xenomorph emerging from a black egg through one of the observation cameras. The idea of rapid monster growth was further developed and realized in Alien Romulus. The chestbusters burst out of the body of one mother, destroying her and gaining the initial impulse for rapid growth. Then it sheds its skin and penetrates the body of the second mother, in this case the hull of the Corbelan ship, whose artificial intelligence, as we remember, also bore the name Mother. Here's what the film director Fede Alvarez said about it during one of his streams.
But the cocoon is kind of blend in with the ship, so you see all the tubes on the wall, like running through the wall, and they start turning into some organic matter, and they turn to cocoon, which for me was a good way to justify why does he have all the biomechanical aspect of the creature, because it's almost like it taking the energy, like if in a way, like it's taking the DNA of the mechanics of the ship. But again, for a new generation, for a new audience, haven't seen it. If they see that and then they see that it's growing, has these pipes on the side of his head, you go, oh, fuck, look at that. Like it's kind of born out of the mix of the ship and in its own DNA.
Metaphorically, the ship here acts as a fully fledged living mother. The phallic-shaped object fertilizes it from the outside, and after a certain period of time, Corbelan gives birth to a child, but this time it's biomechanical, much larger and more aggressive. Apparently, the Xenomorph is not only capable of using metals as a building material for its exoskeleton, like scorpions or some insects do, but also of incorporating them into its metabolism as an energy source. There's nothing fundamentally impossible about this either. Some bacteria in our world are capable of such feats. I think some details of the film can be interpreted as the Xenomorph eating elements of the ship's interior.
I thought you fixed 12 module.
We did. I don't understand it.
Alright, from the libido of the Xenomorph, I suggest we move on to a more mysterious layer, one that is much less talked about and known, the religious layer. As a reminder, the original idea was that the ancestor of the Xenomorphs reproduces exclusively through the accompaniment of their complex reproductive process with religious rituals. Everything worked in symbiosis because the process involved not only the creation of new life, but also the destruction of the old through a sacrificial ritual. You'd agree that religion in this philosophy is clearly in place. After all, it is the best painkiller before inevitable death. It's better to approach the sacrificial altar being absolutely sure that it's not the end yet. Perhaps the most apparent religious motives are seen in the deaths of the simple workers, mechanics, and the inhabitants of the lower deck of the Nostromo, Brett and Parker. By the way, in one of the dialogues, Parker gives an astonishingly accurate description of his colleague.
Well, I think I know why they don't come down here. It's because of you. You don't have no personality.
Brett is a very simple and down-to-earth person. He's the last person on the Nostromo and spends most of his time rummaging around in the dirt and smoke below. Brett is completely devoid on his own identity, so much so that he's too shy to express his opinion at the common table and doesn't dare ask for a promotion, something Parker tries to help him with. Brett is utterly lacking in will, character and personal opinion. His vocabulary is limited, and when speaking with those of higher rank, it's reduced to a single word expressing unquestioning agreement.
Whenever he says anything, you say, right, Brett, you know that?
Right.
With this key aspect of his character in mind, let's now take a close look at how this man will end his life. Brett receives another order to find the cat Jonesy and goes off to search for him. Wandering through the corridors of the Nostromo, the character finally ends up in a rather curious location, which the director described as follows. We got hold of marvelous, actual huge jet engines and installed them, and they're like copper metal with some steel. We use them as four main supports, like columns, and they give a lot of feeling of a temple. We played the same music we used in the derelict alien craft, and we had two temples. The idol I wanted was through these massive gold doors, which were as big as wall, with a gap in them through which the claw can be seen. When the set was dressed, it looked like Aladdin's cave. Also note how Ridley describes the room with the space jockey as another temple. We'll return to this shortly. It turns out that Brett enters a symbolic temple, squeezing through a narrow gap in its gates. In the center of the temple is an altar with metal chains hanging over it like vines, and condensation dripping down, creating the effect of tropical jungles. The Xenomorph loves moisture and heat, so it's logical that this particular spot was chosen to build its nest. In the original version, the Xenomorph was supposed to hover over Brett as if crucified, then descend and with its tail between his legs reach for his neck. It would then crush his skull and drag the victim upwards. Before this, the man approached the altar, passing through a cleansing rain that washes away all his sins before death, so that the Savior could descend from the heavens lens and take him into the light. Around this room, the precious equipment of the Nostromo is stored, painted in copper and gold, like treasures of the pharaohs and gifts presented to the Almighty. Agree, all of this conceptually looks more like a religious sacrifice than a mere murder, as if it's happened in some ancient Mayan temple. Brett doesn't even try to escape. He approaches the altar like a submissive animal and surrenders himself to the mercy of the gods. Additional photos also reveal that the Xenomorph's tail in this scene sticks out from an unusual side. I can say with 100% certainty, but this might be the only costume made specifically for this scene, purely for convenience. Or perhaps it's an intermediate stage of the monster's development. The thing is, in some interviews, Ridley mentioned that this appendage was actually not originally a tail, but the Xenomorph's muscle, its umbilical cord. With it, it seemingly wraps around Brett and neutralizes him, symbolically returning the child to a state of bliss in the womb before death. In this context, Parker's death is also interesting. He's Brett's colleague who's killed by the Xenomorph with a hole through his forehead, right at the site of the third eye. The actor voiced his discontent about this detail in interviews. As the alien closed in on Parker, I noticed that its projected mouth organ was headed straight for the space between my eyebrows, the so-called location of the spiritual eye. Why was Ridley doing this? My mind screamed. You could say that it's all just a coincidence or an actor's superstition, but if you look closely at Parker's corpse in the movie, you'll definitely see a meditative pose. Here, as with Brett, they're telling us about Parker's psychological state before his death. When faced with the Xenomorph, he underwent something similar to a religious experience, paralyzing terror, followed by inner peace and total acceptance of death, reducing the consciousness of the psyche to a childlike level, which in many religions is seen as a sign of spiritual enlightenment. Since we are already discussing deaths in the film, why not also touch upon Lambert? There were either 5 or 6 versions of her death, and none of them satisfied the director. The actress often recalled in interviews this scene in the locker where she was supposed to hide from the alien and die of fear. Unfortunately, it was never filmed. In Lambert's case, due to lack of time and resources, she was killed off-screen using fragments from other scenes, like Brett's legs. Although, judging by the screams Ripley hears, Lambert was experienced both pain and pleasure simultaneously. All I can assume is I got raped by the alien. As you can see, the idea was that an encounter with the Xenomorph should provoke highly contradictory feelings, from horror, paralysis and stupefaction to curiosity and obedience. This is a very wide spectrum of emotions, but all of them fit within the framework of religious experience, which is accompanied by what is called the numinous. It's an incredibly intense experience of an event, a miracle which shattered the old worldview and triggers processes in the brain that rapidly reconstruct this worldview. In fact, for Ridley Scott, the Xenomorph is an entity identical to Kubrick's Black Monolith, if we consider it from the perspective of its impact on the environment. As further confirmation of my thought, I'll give you a couple of excerpts from the recently released Romulus. Fede Alvarez is clearly on the same page and compares the Xenomorph's presence in space to the Black Monolith in A Space Odyssey. He imitates Kubrick in shooting style, aesthetics and of course music, which helps the viewer feel the sense of numinousness, this feeling of a terrifying divine presence. By the way, similar motifs appear in the Remus space module, which symbolizes the space of the first alien. Listen to what sounds accompany the first appearance of the adult Xenomorph. Everything I'm saying may seem strange to you. How can the Xenomorph combine what seems incompatible? People are afraid of it, but at the same time they are fascinated by it and try to get closer. Kane is terrified to look into the egg, but he does it anyway. Not because he's foolish, but because he's almost hypnotized by this object. His fear is suppressed by curiosity. By the way, in the theatrical version, the gun in Kane's hand is absent in this scene. It was added later in the director's version, and as it seemed to me not without reason, it perfectly illustrates the idea I've expressed. At the same time, Kubrick's black monolith symbolizes a door or portal between two worlds, the objective and subjective, the technological and the spiritual. The Xenomorph also possesses a similar polarizing effect. I think you're already guesses that in Prometheus the mural serves the same role as the black monolith. It is here that the engineers first encountered the miracle, and their world was transformed. They received an evolutionary turn and technologies that ultimately allowed them to create the biblical paradise, in which both gods and their creation can live forever. The gods in the literal sense of the word, for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, using the Xenomorph's technology, and the inhabitants of Eden in a metaphysical sense. They are like Brett and Parker, inhabitants of the lower decks, losing the sense of fear of death. In Kubrick's work, the religious experience became the trigger for the technological development of humans, which made their appearance on the moon inevitable, where they would find the next mysterious monolith. And in Prometheus and even in Alien something similar happens. This fossilized body of the engineer is functionally no different from the black monolith, and Giger didn't compare it to one for nothing. Ridley in turn called this place a temple. The artist and director's goal was to shock the viewer in this scene, to show something illogical, otherworldly and unimaginable, thereby provoking those very feelings of fear and curiosity, mystery and paralysis. People were doomed to be here. They were destined to continue the technological race and find themselves at the point of complete dependence of technology. The machines would consume them, and then they would be destroyed by the monster that had burst out from the inner cosmos of their unconscious. Most of science fiction is not so much about events in the future, but about humanity's fears in the present. In our case, we are talking about the year 1979 when Alien hit the theaters. By this time, medicine had already performed heart transplants, the first in vitro fertilization, and was already having discussions about the possibility that genetics might one day create more perfect humans. Advances in these fields sparked a new wave of interest from science fiction writers in the human body. After Alien, many iconic works on this theme were created, such as the aforementioned Blade Runner and the famous Terminator. It might be hard to believe now, but back then a film about metallic cyborg was quite terrifying, and many found it difficult to accept the very idea of metallic cyborg in the human body. The fear of external interference in the human body was always frightening us, but perhaps the most resistance was caused by the idea that human reproduction could be entirely mechanized rather than natural. In vitro fertilization is a commonplace procedure today, but in 1979 all of this was still new. Society was alarmed, fearing the emergent trend and realizing that this was just the beginning. How would our world change if in the future all reproductive processes of the human body were controlled by technology, commercialized to the maximum and detached from human biology? In the modern world, in developed countries, conception, pregnancy and especially childbirth are the responsibility of specialists. This trend is relatively new, as for most of human history, reproduction happened naturally. But process does not stand still, and the more science integrates into this area, the more complex and dangerous dangerous the idea of becoming a parent seems. What was once considered a common matter has now turned into a dangerous process with many variables, unimaginable without proper technological support. It is possible that for future generations, 9 months of suffering and bloody childbirth will be seen as a sign of society's backwardness. People of the future will not be born in the mother's womb, but through a different, more comfortable, controlled and mechanized method for the parents. The gradually disappearing boundary between the sexes in this case will completely vanish. Sterility will give a green light to sex without obligations, and the concept of mother will gradually fade from our minds and memories. A good reference here would be Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World, written in the first half of the last century. It presents a utopia where there are no marriages or families. Sex is considered a privilege of civilized society and is introduced from kindergarten. Meanwhile, chastity, pregnancy and childbirth are seen as animal perversions and are common only among savages in reservations, fenced off from civilization by electric walls. In this society, the word mother, when referring to a woman, is simply offensive. The role of the parent has long been performed by machines, not living people. The difference is that technological reproduction is devoid of blood and sweat, and if people get used to this, after several generations, the very thought of it might evoke horror. In the Brave New World, a person lives according to their carnal pleasures, without caring to suppress them, but at the same time, love disappears from their daily lives. Around this time, we find ourselves around the Nostromo thug. In the early script, more attention was given to sexual relations aboard, but for various reasons, most of it was ultimately not realized. Let's start with the fact that on the Nostromo, there were casual sexual relationships between crew members. There were a few challenges, sure. If you have women up there, how come there's no love interest? It's pity that the one scene we did have in this screenplay that had sex in it had to be cut. It showed that you couldn't afford to have love affairs in deep space. If you do, you immediately have two groups aboard. The pair who are in love and the rest of the crew. That's the beginning of problems unless you are space pioneer and settle down with your family. On board the Nostromo there were no family relationships, but there were casual sexual relationships in all their diversity. Originally, the film was supposed to have quite a bit of nudity, with only Ripley's final striptease surviving. Again, it was originally intended not to end just a tank top and panties. Originally, in the movie everyone was naked, and one of the things I thought was very interesting about the film, because again I was coming from theater, I wasn't thinking about markets and Catholics and ratings and censorship, was it was so striking to think of these pink creatures, very vulnerable creatures, moving through this very harsh metallic environment. That was in the script at the beginning. We didn't shoot it that way because Fox said we'll lose Spain and we'll lose Italy, so you have to wear clothes. At the same time, it cannot be said that the hints of all these were completely lost. For example, in one of the deleted scenes, Ripley calms Lambert down, doing so as if they were not just friends. Right after that, Ripley asks about sex with Ash, and that fact that neither she nor Lambert slept with him raises her suspicions. Another example is Parker's hint at oral sex towards Lambert, which she understood but was not offended by, rather she blushed.
You pound down the stuff like this.
Listen, I'd rather be eating something else, but
Also, in Alien, Ripley was supposed to have two scenes revealing relationships with two different men. In one of them, she goes up to the captain's bridge and asks Dallas for relax, which happens right after Kane's death. This would have actually told the audience a lot. By the way, this scene was used during Sigourney Weaver's audition.
Look, I need some relief.
Why'd you wait until now?
The portrayal of future societies in Ridley Scott's film reflects a highly liberated view of intimacy, where the boundaries between genders are seen as fluid. These elements, such as communal showers, short haircuts for women, and android designed to traditionally male and female roles, are no accident in Scott's universe. For the characters in the film, it is normal to engage a sexual activity after a tragedy to relieve stress, as seen in Alien Covenant. Sex can even occur between a superior and a subordinate, simply out of boredom, as in Prometheus. In this future, sex is no longer tied to procreation. Why bother with that when a more technological and convenient method of reproduction exists? Free love represents a society where women are liberated from the burdens of reproduction, family structures, and judgment for expressing their sexual desires freely. Everything that happens on the Nostromo is a microcosm of the future society, a global trend for humanity's values and state of consciousness. In the context of libido's importance in global motivations, it's essential to mention the scene where Ash attempts to kill Ripley. She had just learned of his plans and bring an extraterrestrial life sample to Earth at any cost. Ash's method of attack is quite inventive. He places a rolled-up pornographic magazine into her mouth against the backdrop of a wall filled with pictures of naked women, while Ash could have easily snapped Ripley's neck or strangled her, especially since she was unconscious at that moment. Her actions leave no room for interpretation other than an attempt at sexual violence. If you create a model as perfect as that, it will have almost of necessity a form of emotional life. You don't have only a physical and mental mechanism, but a machine that is capable at any moment of uncontrollable emotional reaction and which will take certain decision by itself, like Hell in 2001. Here no one has considered that in building a robot it had been given a physiological life with worries and problems. This perfect machine starts to have feelings when faced with the behavior of humans. It starts to be interested in the women and to have desires that cannot be expressed. Behind this assault on Ripley is an attempt to solve these tensions, a sort of rape. I think you've noticed once again how Ridley referred to A Space Odyssey, comparing Ash to the artificial intelligence of the Discovery ship. Despite Ash's design not including sexual organs, he isn't devoid of internal mechanisms that could, over time, provoke the desire for sexual contact, which is accompanied by the desires to cause harm. This explains the synthetic obsession with the Xenomorphs. They see in it a creature that, despite lacking sexual organs, is capable of reproduction, and by controlling it, they gain the ability to express their repressed sexual desires. This is similar to what happens with David in Prometheus. In the world of Alien, there is an evident paradigm shift happening in the background, where there is less and less space for universal human values like morality and love. The Nostromo spaceship is returning to Earth, but its course is altered after a mysterious signal is intercepted. All crew members either accept the event without question and follow the order, or fear disobedience, perhaps due to the threat of punishment, like losing their monetary reward. But one person on board, a woman named Ripley, tries to question the new course. She attempts to think critically and understand what's happening, which ultimately leads her to see the threat in this signal.
Have you tried putting that transmission through ECIU?
No, Mother hasn't identified it, yes?
You mind if I give it a shot?
She wants to warn the crew about the danger, but Ash resists and prevents her from doing so.
Mother's deciphered part of it. It doesn't look like an SOS.
What is it then?
Well, it looks like a warning. I'm gonna go out after them.
What's the point?
Here a clear conflict begins to form between them, which is arguably the central tension of the film. Every scene between Ripley and Ash is filled with arguments, distrust and contempt. There is simply no room for both of them on the Nostromo. Ash is a spy aboard the ship and a tool of the company's influence. He is the one who serves its mercantile interests. Ripley, on the other hand, is clearly motivated by completely different reasons. Her arc in the first Alien relates to the transformation of her femininity, and in part mirrors Rachel's arc from Blade Runner. Ripley is an officer on the Nostromo, responsible for the safety of both the ship and the crew, and she handles this duty excellently. In the scene with the door opening, Ripley does not rush and acts as detached as possible. She assesses the risk rationally and makes a decision according to quarantine protocols. In contrast, Lambert acts differently. She's overly emotional and breaks down due to the overwhelming fear, though it's not entirely fair to compare the two, as they are on opposite sides of the door. In Alien Romulus, there's a great homage to this scene, except that this time the ones separated are not just colleagues but family members. This brings emotions to the forefront, which could ultimately lead to disaster if not for the unyielding nature of the android. In the first Alien, the android allowed the threat on board instead of blocking it. It's also important to note that all the people on the Nostromo are colleagues, business partners, or at most acquaintances. They are bound together primarily by contracts, work instructions, and their place in the hierarchy. There are no husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, or parents and children here. It's hard to even find genuine friendship that's accompanied by strong emotional attachment. For example, look at how the crew says goodbye to Kane's body.
Anybody want to say anything?
Kane is a part of the team, yet they have nothing to say about him. No bright moments to remember together. They won't be talking about the deceased work accomplishments, will they? Naturally, Ripley stands out here. She's the only one on the Nostromo with a unique connection to another being, her cat, Johnsy. She's willing to take an irrational step for him, overcoming her own fear and setting aside all professional constraints to risk her life for the sake of the cat. Sigourney does the extraordinary thing of going back for a cat, where maybe her only real relationship on the spaceship is the cat. Understand me correctly here, I'm not saying that Ripley cares less about the crew members and more about the cat. What I mean is that her relationship with Johnsy is fundamentally different. Her survival does not depend on the cat, nor does the survival of her team. He isn't bound by multiple directives. In fact, he's more of a burden to them all. Johnsy seems to exist outside of the events of the film, wandering wherever he pleases and confusing the crew's radars. He's like a child, always has a mind of his own. There's even a funny theory online that the cat represents the director himself in the film, who, by the way, is also a redhead. It is the attachment and care Ripley shows towards Johnsy that sets her apart from the others and gives her character real femininity and the capacity for unconditional love. That's why Johnsy is such an important character in Alien. In the beginning, Ripley is mostly focused on her duties, but by the third act of the film, her primary motivation becomes finding and caring for her cat. In one scene, she even finds him sleeping in the captain's chair, which hints at the cat's symbolic role at that moment. Had she not gone after the cat in that moment, driven by her heart, she might have perished alongside Parker and Lambert. Ripley, the executive officer, transforms throughout the film into a loving mother figure. She's driven by love, a human emotion that stands in stark contrast to the motivations of the corporation, the synthetic and the xenomorph. At first, the key to Mother's womb is held by a man who selflessly carries out the company's will without delving into the details. Humanity is largely driven by unconscious motives, mercantile, selfish, and intervened with the constant need to create and perfect technologies that dominates their biological nature. Progress and exploitation lead them to the mysterious planetoid, a place that is dangerous, primordial.
It's almost primordial.
Somewhere here, among the harsh, primitive landscape, the ultimate secret of reproduction is hidden, and it must be brought back to Earth. Have you ever wondered what's depicted on the Alien poster or shown in its trailer? The planet's surface, which as the camera pulls away turns into an egg. It cracks open and begins to emit a bright green glow. That glow that is life itself.
Life. In its most primal, unadulterated form.
In Covenant, which largely mirrors the events of Alien, the planet the astronauts land on is called Paradise. After all, where else but in Paradise could the secret of the creation of living matter be hidden? Look at how organically the Xenomorph fits into the dark corners of the Nostromo. Its biological body seems inseparable from the environment, the future that is its natural habitat, not the humans. Their territory is a small piece of sterilized space with advanced medicine and tasteless food. All these traces of Mother's intervention in the body will instantly vanish once humanity is no longer needed. Right now they are nothing more than seeds, primitive living cells that only activate when given permission, go where directed and do what is required of them. Ripley takes command of the Nostromo after Dallas' death, but the course has already been set and she's unable to alter it. The only option is the complete destruction of Mother, along with the parasite that has infiltrated her. Ellen ties her hair up into a bun and takes on the role of a man. Now that the one who once protected her with his body is dead, the woman picks up a weapon and becomes a protector and leader. Yet all along, deep inside, Ripley has remained feminine, fragile, innocent, and loving. This scene ultimately serves as a reminder of that. The heroine destroys the technological figure of Mother, unclouded by guilt, compassion, or the illusions of morality. Ripley finds herself in a small shuttle, where besides her and John C., her metaphorical child, there is no one else. There are no androids, no corporation, no orders, no hierarchy. Only the dying monster in the wall, whom she must face in a final battle, donning white armor and taking up a spear one last time. This is how I like to look at reality. It's not simply a question of knowing whether or not Ripley will triumph. I wanted to introduce another dimension. She takes up the fight against some futuristic dragon. That's why I made her put on the white spacesuit. She's possessed by the idea of this confrontation and her behavior changes completely. Ripley defeats the Xenomorph while humming the low song "You're My Lucky Star," which helps her maintain her composure. On a thematic level, the creature is destroyed because it cannot exist in a space dominated solely by love. Ripley tucks John C. in for the night and joins him. Her shuttle will be drifting through the endless cosmos for decades, but the heroine still falls into a sweet sleep, cocooned away from the hostile technological world in which she's doomed to feel like an alien.